So for a lot of players, part of the appeal of Dungeons & Dragons is the rich mythology and history that it's accumulated over the years. So do you want to build a character that's really invested in that fantasy world's culture and religion? Do you want to play a character that can support its allies and pivot roles mid-combat? Well, today we're going to get a little bit clerical and look at why you would pick a cleric as your character class in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. Hi everybody, my name is John from DM Shower Thoughts, where we find our best selves through gaming. Now today the character class that we're looking at is the Cleric, and really looking at what its distinct mechanics are when you're building your character for 5th edition D&D. Now before we go any further, I do want to preface this conversation pretty heavily. So to start, in this series so far, we've been really examining each class's mechanics outside of its prescribed lore. And for a lot of classes, there's a really strong harmony between the class's story and its mechanics. An example being Bardic Inspiration, and how that's a mechanical expression of the bard's story of supporting its allies. But Cleric is the first class we're going to dive into, where the story that you want to tell with your character is directly going to impact the mechanical choices that you can make. Now, like always, we're going to break down the mechanics to really emphasize the Cleric's unique play style. And as with all of the full casters, I'm not going to do a spell-by-spell evaluation, but rather I'm going to be commenting on the general trends you see in their spell list and name a few standout spells that I've seen work particularly well, both for function and flavor. Now, second, this is also going to be a class that might have some real-world feelings kind of attached to it. So, real talk for a moment. So D&D garnered quite a reputation in the early 90s, and there are certain parts of its lore that some individuals are uncomfortable with. I've had individuals respectfully decline partaking in D&D because the role-playing of polytheistic traditions conflicted with their real-world faith. And that was outside of D&D's reputation of encouraging devil worship. Some individuals are going to be uncomfortable with diving into topics like faith and religion, and we as Dungeon Masters want to respect that. In fact, remember, our tagline at DM Shower Thoughts is we're trying to find our best selves through gaming. And that might mean we have to adjust the topics that we address table by table. And I find that purposefully antagonizing certain individuals that are just uncomfortable with certain themes in a gaming environment also directly goes against our mission. So this is just a reminder that clerics don't have to worship deities. Sometimes their power is gained due to an adherence to a specific philosophy or a commitment to a specific coda. And it's just something to note that with this class's particular design, there is a lot of cultural baggage both in the real world and in the fantasy world. So, now that we've gotten some of those story considerations out of the way, let's pop into the class's distinct mechanics. So, major mechanic number 1 is the Cleric's Divine Domain. Now, so far, we haven't really been covering subclasses in this video series, and it might feel a little cheap to just say that a subclass is part of the class's major mechanic. But in my opinion, what we're really examining with this video series is identifying each class's unique playstyle. And no class's distinct playstyle is as impacted by its subclass selection as the Cleric. For example, a Tempest Cleric has proficiency in heavy armor and martial weapons, and that's going to lead to a very different playstyle than a Knowledge Cleric that has expertise in 2 kinds of knowledge skills, as well as more supporting the spell casting side of the Cleric's progression. So, your Divine Domain allows you to have prepared at all times extra spells, and most of them also give you extra proficiencies. And in addition to all that, once you hit 2nd level, it'll also give you an additional option to use your channel Divinity. More on that mechanic later. Right at level 1, your Divine Domain is really going to solidify your Cleric's preferred role, although with its other features it can pivot mid-combat. For example, the aforementioned Tempest Cleric can be an excellent tank because of that heavy armor proficiency. Order Domain Clerics from Ravnica can really support other melee allies by allowing them to deal extra damage along with their healing and buff spells. And life domain clerics can keep everybody up and healthy, and they're some of the most efficient healers in the game. Now, your divine domain also determines the kind of deity or philosophy that your cleric ascribes to. So, this mechanical choice has direct role-playing consequences to your character's story. And also, it's a great opportunity for a DM to integrate your cleric into the world, which can only help with immersion. So even though the divine domain is a subclass selection, it's so integral to the cleric's mechanical performance that I have to mention it. And that brings us to major mechanic number 2, which is the cleric's spell casting feature. The cleric's spell list, by default, tends to lend itself towards support and area of effect spells. Even its damaging spells tend to have some kind of support effects built into them, so not only is the cleric able to contribute in terms of damage, they're able to set up their other allies to be better versions of themselves. For example, when the Guiding Bolt spell hits a target, it gives the next attack roll against it advantage. And it also deals 4d6 radiant damage, which is nothing to sneeze at for a first level spell. Another example is Spirit Guardians, which not only has a damage type that can be adjusted based on your character's alignment, but it also deals decent damage at a consistent rate, as well as a debuff effect where it gets to have the speed of any enemies that are in its area. Cleric also has some of the most powerful and versatile healing spells in the game, although it doesn't have access to Healing Spirit. And this is also a great time to mention that the Cleric list in particular seems to have a lot of spell selection that allows you to manipulate its action economy kind of finely. And this includes a lot of spells that can be used as a bonus action, a lot of spells with an action, spells that require concentration, and a lot of spells that don't. In fact, building a cleric, I was actually surprised at how many spells maintain a consistent effect without having to require concentration, even at a lower level. These spells include things like Aid and Spiritual Weapon that are both extremely helpful for second level spells, and because they don't require concentration, you can freely buff your allies and contribute in a lot of ways without being bogged down by having to choose between 2 concentration spells. And this, of course, lends the cleric to being a very flexible character from both a build and performance standpoint. So now for some standout spells I've seen work really well from the cleric list. And these include Toll the Dead, Bless, Command, Guiding Bolt, Healing Word, Sanctuary, Shield of Faith, Aid, Lesser and Greater Restoration, Silence, Spiritual Weapon, Revivify, Spirit Guardians, Death Ward, Flame Strike, Holy Weapon, Heal, Resurrection, Holy Aura, and Mass Heal. Gosh, doing that for the second time makes me feel like I'm doing the Pokey rap. Charmeleon, War Turtle, Mewtwo, Tentacruel, Aerodactyl. And those are also spells that are only found on the generic cleric spell list. Remember that your divine domain gives you 10 additional spells that don't count against the amount of spells that you can prepare. So in addition to all of those support spells, you might also have clerics running around casting Fireball or Animate Objects. Something else I failed to mention in the Bard video is that a recent Unearthed Arcana called Class Feature Variants offered expanded spell lists for each of the main spellcasters. Those expanded spell lists aren't official yet, but they are something I'd be really curious to hear about in play. Which brings us to major mechanic number 3, which is the cleric's Channel Divinity. So, gained at 2nd level, Channel Divinity is an additional option for a cleric to create certain magical effects without having to cast a spell, which can sometimes free up its action economy. Because remember, if you cast a spell as a bonus action, the only spell you can cast with your action on the same turn is a cantrip. Now, all clerics gain the Turn Undead Channel Divinity. This forces undead within 30 feet of the cleric to make a wisdom save or be frightened of the cleric. And as you level up, eventually that turn feature becomes a destroy feature for certain weaker undead. And your divine domain also unlocks an additional use of Channel Divinity based on your subclass selection. Now notice how that divine domain showed up again? Really, cleric can be so many things, but that divine domain is going to impact your cleric's entire mechanical progression. For example, a Tempest Cleric's Divine Domain allows it to max out any lightning or thunder damage that it deals, rather than having to roll the dice. And a Light Cleric's Divine Domain gives it a reaction that can impose disadvantage on attack rolls against it. And with that light cleric channel divinity, eventually it upgrades so you can even protect your allies with that reaction. The other nice thing about channel divinity is that its uses reset every short rest. Meaning if your DM often calls for short rests, that only makes the cleric a lot more versatile and a lot more powerful. So now on to major mechanic number 4, which is divine intervention. Now unlike other classes in this series, cleric really only has 4 distinct mechanics. And that's also because its spell list is really powerful and really varied. Now divine intervention isn't something you get until 10th level cleric. And really, you use your action to implore your deity for help. And this can be where things can get dicey with certain players. When you use your action to do this, you roll a percentile die, and if you get your cleric level or lower, the deity does help you out. However, the DM gets to determine how the deity helps you out, and it may not be exactly what you want. So this can be a very powerful mechanic, and the DM may reward the player based on role-playing that they've done with their deity or with their faith. And that's why it can be hard to separate the story and mechanics of this class, because the mechanical resolution of this feature may be directly dependent on role-playing or storytelling that you've done prior to its use. If you've been really active in developing your character's religion, faith, or their relationship with their deity, the DM may reward you greater when you use this feature. And let's say you've been doing the opposite, where you've been making choices that go against your deity's philosophies, then maybe the DM may even punish you when you try to use this feature. Now, the one nice thing is once you hit 20th level cleric, you don't have to roll for this feature. It automatically goes off once you use it as an action. But again, it's up to the DM to determine how the divine intervention shapes. The other thing is it has a really long cooldown period where you can only use it every 7 days. So although it can be extremely powerful, you want to make sure you only use it if you really need it. So, even though Cleric only has 4 distinct mechanics in its vanilla leveling progression, having been playing a tier 2 level Cleric, it's a really beastly class. The channel divinity and spellcasting features alone are incredibly powerful, and once you stack the unique features you get from your divine domain, this class is extremely competitive in terms of spellcasters. They're one of my favorite characters to build for, and because their story is so integral to their mechanical performance, it can be an extremely rewarding class to play. This also has to do with the fact that the cleric's storytelling function and their purpose for having their powers is directly situated in the world that your DM is creating. So now for some rough spots to smooth over. Like I said, there are some individuals that may be more or less comfortable with delving into topics such as religion and faith in a D&D world. And we're not even going to touch on certain controversies like religious corruption or anything like that. More so than with any other class, you really want to discuss with your DM ahead of time how your character came about their powers. So do yourself and your table a favor, ask your DM what the relevant deities are before going about and creating an intricate backstory that the DM may not approve of. And again, this isn't meant to quash your creativity, this is meant as a check-in to make sure you and the DM are on the same page so you can deliver the greatest experience for everyone at the table. And it may be that if you choose a deity or philosophy that doesn't yet exist in their world, they can create that deity and add it to the pantheon. Or it may be that your specific deity is an aspect of another deity that hasn't been explored yet. For example, in Faerun, the halfling deity Yandala is actually just a different aspect of Shantae. And even though they're often worshipped as 2 separate entities, really it's the same entity but with 2 different interpretations. And that could be a cool story to explore in your character's arc as well. So now more on to the mechanical hiccups that can come with this class. First, if you have a player that's never played a spellcaster before, they have to understand spell slots and concentration, along with the rule that I referenced earlier, so if they cast a bonus action spell, they can only use their action to use a cantrip. So another thing is that a lot of cleric cantrips are saving throw based, and if you have players that are used to rolling to hit, it may take them some time to create the new habit of looking up their spell save DC and letting you as the dungeon master know what kind of saving throw your monsters need to make. Another thing is that cleric spellcasting is based on prepared spells rather than spells known, So it may take some time for a new player to understand that language, and also understand that after every long rest, they can swap out different spells on their list to things that might be a little more appropriate. So now I want to hear from you. What's been your experiences with clerics and their stories in the tables that you've been a part of? And have you ever had a divine intervention actually go off? Let me know in the comments below, and remember, game responsibly. Bye-bye now.